What if the weapon that changes everything doesn't explode, doesn't make a sound, and costs less than a cup of coffee to fire? That's not a riddle. That's what happened in the Strait of Hormuz. And the reason most people don't fully understand what it means yet is because the mainstream coverage is still speaking the old language, the language of missiles, negotiations, and ceasefire timelines, while the actual turning point has already happened. Quietly, at the speed of light. Before we go deeper, if you're someone who wants to understand the world at a level most people never reach, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with one person who thinks they're following this story, and like this video because this one matters. Now let's talk about what actually happened. On June 15th, 2026, the U.S. Navy confirmed something that military analysts around the world are still trying to fully process. A directed energy weapon, a high-powered laser system, was used in real active combat conditions in one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Not a test, not a drill, not a press release designed to send a message. An actual operational deployment in a live conflict against real Iranian threats producing real results. The name of the system is Helios, high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance. And what it did in the Strait of Hormuz didn't just win a single engagement, it ended an entire military strategy that Iran spent 4 decades building. To understand why this moment is so significant, you have to go back to the beginning, not to last week, not to last year. Back to the early 1980s, when Iran first looked at the United States Navy and asked itself a question that would shape everything that followed. How do you fight the most powerful Navy in the history of the world when you can't afford to build one? That question wasn't defeatist. It was the start of one of the most carefully constructed military strategies of the modern era. Iran looked at American aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, nuclear submarines, and the sophisticated battle networks connecting all of them. And it didn't flinch. It didn't try to match them ship for ship because it knew that was impossible. Instead, Iran found a smarter angle. The strategy was called cost asymmetry. And once you understand how it works, you realize it wasn't a desperate fallback. It was a genuine masterstroke. Here's the core logic. A modern U.S. Navy destroyer, the Arleigh Burke class, the exact ships operating in the Strait of Hormuz right now, carries a finite number of interceptor missiles, the SM-2, the SM-6, the evolved Sea Sparrow. These are extraordinary defensive weapons. They work. They are among the most effective systems ever built for protecting a ship from incoming threats, but each one costs between $1 and $4 million per shot. And each destroyer carries a specific, countable number of them. Fire enough, and the magazine empties. When the magazine empties, the ship is exposed. Iran looked at that math and made a decision. Instead of building expensive warships, it would build enormous quantities of cheap weapons designed specifically to drain those expensive magazines dry. Force the United States to spend $1 million defending against a $20,000 drone. Do it enough times, and the math collapses in your favor. That insight produced the Shahed drone series, loitering munitions that can be manufactured for tens of thousands of dollars per unit, produced at industrial scale, and launched in coordinated swarms designed to overwhelm defensive systems through pure volume. The idea wasn't that any single drone would get through. The idea was that when you launch enough of them simultaneously from multiple directions, you eventually exhaust the interceptors protecting the ship, and something reaches the hull. It was elegant, it was patient, and it worked. Not just for Iran, but for every non-conventional military force watching. Russia bought the concept and deployed it in Ukraine. Houthi forces used it to terrorize Red Sea commercial shipping. The drone swarm became the template for how a weaker power punches above its weight against a superior naval force. Military planners across the world were losing sleep over the long-term implications. A $20,000 drone credibly threatening a multi-billion-dollar warship. The math was real. The threat was real. And for years, there was no clean answer. Then the United States deployed Helios. Here's what happened on May 7th of this year. The IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, launched its largest coordinated maritime attack of this entire conflict. A multi-vector drone swarm targeting a group of 3 American destroyers transiting from the northern Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Oman. This was the doctrine in action. Everything they had refined over 20 years deployed at scale, with the operational expectation that saturation volume would overwhelm the defensive systems aboard those ships. 0 hits. All 3 destroyers completed the transit without a scratch. Within 48 hours, 4 Iranian port facilities used to stage and coordinate that attack were in flames. That outcome is not just a tactical result, it is the documented failure of a doctrine. And the reason for that failure was a weapon that operated in a way Iran's commanders had never experienced before and had no answer for. Let's talk about what Helios actually does, because the coverage has consistently undersold this. The system generates 60 kilowatts of focus-directed energy from a beam director mounted on the ship's superstructure. To give that number real meaning, it's roughly equivalent to the combined power draw of 60 household hairdryers focused into a single coherent beam directed at a target with enough precision to strike a specific sensor array on a drone the size of a suitcase at ranges measured in kilometers. The cost per engagement is measured in cents, not dollars. Cents. Against a Shahed drone representing somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 of Iranian manufacturing investment, Helios achieves a kill at a cost ratio so lopsided that the entire strategic logic of the drone swarm doesn't just get countered, it gets inverted. The attacker is now the party burning through irreplaceable resources. The defender is spending electricity. But here's the part that doesn't get discussed enough. The cost advantage, as decisive as it is, isn't even the most important thing Helios does. The most important thing it does is break the information loop that makes a drone swarm work. When a traditional interceptor missile shoots down a drone, something visible happens. An explosion, a radar signature, a debris field. The Iranian operators monitoring their drones from ground control stations can see the engagement. They can count the intercepts. They can track the rate at which the defending ship's magazine is being depleted. They can adjust their launch timing, their approach vectors, their swarm density to optimize toward the moment the magazine empties. The entire strategy depends on that feedback loop staying intact. Observe, adjust, escalate, deplete. When Helios engages a drone, the loop breaks completely. The drone simply disappears from the operator's telemetry feed. One moment, it's on approach, transmitting position and status. The next moment, the signal is gone. No explosion, no radar signature of an interceptor launch. No debris field. The drone ceases to exist in functional form and falls into the water below. Silently, invisibly, without providing any information about what happened to it. The operator staring at the screen cannot tell if the drone had a mechanical failure, if its command link was disrupted, if something engaged it from a direction their sensors can't detect. They have nothing. No data to learn from, no pattern to adjust to, no optimization available. This is what military doctrine calls operating in an information-denied environment. And for a tactical system that depends entirely on real-time coordinated adjustment of multiple assets to create overwhelming saturation pressure, it is catastrophic. Working alongside Helios is a companion system called Odin, the optical dazzling interdictor. Where Helios burns through a drone's structure with sustained directed energy, Odin uses a focused laser to blind the drone's electro-optical and infrared sensors. The drone doesn't die immediately. It goes operationally blind. It loses its targeting solution. It loses its attack geometry. And it becomes either a crash risk on its own or a disoriented platform that conventional close-in weapon systems can engage at a fraction of the cost of a standard interceptor. Together, the two systems create a layered defensive architecture that destroys the leading elements of an incoming swarm while blinding the trailing elements, dismantling what was designed as a coordinated tactical instrument and reducing it to a collection of confused, disconnected platforms flying without mutual reference through a defended airspace where each one of them is a managed problem rather than a contributing part of something larger. The swarm worked because of coordination. Individual drones aren't threatening in isolation. They become threatening when they arrive simultaneously from multiple directions in numbers that exceed the intercept capacity of point defense systems. Remove the coordination, blind the guidance, destroy the lead elements, the trailing elements we're using as navigational reference. The swarm stops being a swarm. It becomes debris waiting to happen. Now here's something worth pausing on, because this is where you should actually stop, think, and share what you just learned. Here's a challenge. Pause this video right now and send it to one person who's been following this conflict. Not because you want them to agree with you on politics, but because this specific technical reality, the cost inversion, the broken information loop, the end of the swarm doctrine, is something they almost certainly haven't heard explained this clearly anywhere else. Drop a comment below with the word Helios if this is already changing how you think about the story. Because what comes next makes this even more important. The numbers from this conflict taken together tell a story that no single headline has fully assembled. Since the start of the current operation, American strikes on Iranian coastal defense infrastructure, drone manufacturing facilities, and IRGC command nodes have degraded Iranian drone production capacity by an estimated 40 to 60%. The IRGC entered this conflict with a ballistic missile stockpile representing decades of investment. As of June 15th, that stockpile sits at approximately 70% of pre-conflict levels, meaning 30% has been expended or destroyed through a combination of American strikes and operational employment. 30% of a large number is still a large number. This matters, but the direction of that number matters more. It is moving in one direction only, and there is no mechanism visible to reverse it. The 4 Iranian port facilities destroyed in the 48 hours after the May 7th engagement were not random military targets. They were critical nodes in the coastal defense logistics network, the physical infrastructure connecting the IRGC's maritime capability to the supply chain keeping it operational. Replacing that infrastructure takes years under any realistic scenario, even one where sanctions were lifted tomorrow. Every drone expended in an engagement against a Helios-equipped vessel is a manufacturing investment that does not come back. Every manufacturing investment that doesn't come back is a reduction in the inventory representing Iran's viable kinetic options, short of its remaining ballistic missile reserve. The mathematics of attrition are running against the IRGC in a direction that no amount of institutional willpower can reverse. Will does not manufacture drones. Infrastructure does. And the infrastructure is burning. Now let's look at what's happening on 3 tracks simultaneously, because this conflict is not one-dimensional, and the reason it's approaching a genuine inflection point is that all 3 dimensions are converging at the same time. On the financial track, economic pressure on the Iranian state has reached a level showing up in the indicators that matter most to ordinary Iranian citizens. The exchange rate, the inflation rate, the energy subsidy structure that has historically shielded the population from the full impact of sanctions-related economic pain. The rial has experienced a sustained depreciation that economists tracking the Iranian economy describe as among the most severe in the Islamic Republic's history. Oil revenues constrained by the insurance and shipping embargo following the extension of conflict into the Red Sea are no longer covering both the social contract the government maintains with its people and the military budget funding IRGC operations. The financial track is compressing the decision space. Every additional week of conflict costs more than depleted production infrastructure can replace, more than constrained revenues can offset, more than reserves can absorb without the civilian population eventually feeling it at the grocery store, at the fuel pump, at the mortgage office. That is not metaphor. That is the transmission mechanism through which geopolitical conflict becomes personal economic reality for millions of people. On the military track, every operational metric is moving against the IRGC's ability to sustain asymmetric pressure. The drone swarm option has been closed by Helios. The fast attack boat option was degraded by helicopter engagements that destroyed significant portions of the IRGC Navy's small craft inventory before those boats reached engagement range. Coastal defense missile batteries that survived the initial American strike campaign are operating under continuous surveillance pressure that reduces their ability to reposition without detection. And detection in this environment is the precondition for a counterstrike. On the psychological track, the most underanalyzed dimension of this entire conflict, the IRGC is experiencing something that military psychologists studying institutional behavior recognize as among the most dangerous conditions a fighting organization can inhabit. It is the condition of being unable to demonstrate effectiveness to its own people, while simultaneously needing to project effectiveness to maintain the institutional cohesion that allows it to function at all. The IRGC's public response to the Helios activation has followed a pattern that's analytically revealing. State media declarations of continued effectiveness, formal announcements of new exercises named with the specific vocabulary of martyrdom and resistance, carefully managed imagery of IRGC naval units conducting operations designed to project capability without actually engaging the systems that have demonstrated their ineffectiveness in verified combat conditions. The IRGC is performing capability precisely in the spaces where it is not being tested. It is avoiding the spaces where the testing has produced results it cannot explain to its own constituency. A military organization confident in its capabilities does not demonstrate them selectively. It demonstrates them where the resistance is greatest, where the test is hardest, where the outcome is most disputed. The drone swarms are not being launched against the ships equipped with Helios. The fast attack boats are not making runs at destroyer task groups. The operations being featured in state media are occurring in waters and against conditions where the directed energy systems are not present. This behavioral pattern is the most analytically significant signal of the past several weeks. An institution in the process of quietly reconsidering its core strategy does not announce the reconsideration publicly. It announces successes. It creates imagery of effectiveness. It manages the information environment to preserve the narrative of deterrence, even as that deterrence is being systematically dismantled engagement by engagement. The IRGC is doing exactly this. And the behavior of an institution managing its narrative in the face of operational failure is one of the clearest signals in strategic analysis that the internal calculation has already shifted, even if the external posture hasn't caught up yet. The posture always lags the calculation. Knowing that, you know the calculation has shifted. Now comes the part of this analysis that serious observers need to sit with carefully, because it's the part that carries the most risk, and the part that mainstream coverage is discussing least. The Helios activation and the operational record it has produced are creating a specific internal dynamic inside the IRGC that is actually the most dangerous condition this conflict has generated. Not because it makes further Iranian resistance impossible, but because it creates the conditions for a specific kind of escalation, qualitatively different from anything seen so far, and against which the current diplomatic and operational architecture is not positioned to respond quickly enough to prevent consequences. The hardline faction within the IRGC that ordered the May 7th attack has a problem that is not primarily military. It is political in the deepest sense of the word. The narrative of resistance that gives the IRGC its institutional identity, the story it tells its own soldiers, its own commanders, the clerical establishment, the broader regional constituency it has cultivated for decades, depends entirely on the credibility of the threat it poses to American forces in the Strait. That credibility has now been operationally documented as insufficient against the current American defensive architecture. The hardline faction cannot accept this conclusion publicly, but it also cannot keep proving it through additional drone swarm attacks that produce zero results and consume irreplaceable manufacturing inventory at a rate the degraded production infrastructure cannot sustain. It is trapped between two conclusions that are both unacceptable, and it did not build its institutional identity on the capacity to choose between unacceptable options with patience and clarity. The exit from this trap that analysts should be watching most carefully in the days ahead is a dramatic action using a different capability category, specifically the ballistic missile stockpile. The deep bunker reserves representing roughly 70% of pre-conflict levels. The mobile launchers being repositioned along dispersal routes that American surveillance assets are actively tracking. Shore-based anti-ship missiles with ranges extending to 100 miles. A ballistic missile strike against American assets, even one that is intercepted, even one that produces no operational effect on the defending forces, produces a visible event. It creates the imagery of resistance. It demonstrates that the IRGC can still impose costs, even if it cannot impose the costs its original doctrine was designed to deliver. And crucially, it forces a response that escalates the conflict to a level where the negotiated exit becomes far more complicated. This is the risk that serious analysts are genuinely losing sleep over right now. Not that the IRGC cannot be defeated operationally. The evidence from this conflict shows it is being degraded systematically across every dimension. The risk is that the faction within the IRGC that cannot accept defeat responds with an action designed not to change the military outcome, but to change the political environment in a way that forecloses the diplomatic options currently still on the table. There is a weapon deployment request sitting unsigned in Washington right now. The Dark Eagle hypersonic glide vehicle, a system traveling at Mach 17 that would close the ballistic missile option the same way Helios closed the drone swarm option. It exists precisely because this scenario has been war-gamed and assessed as having real, non-trivial probability. But deterrence only works if the deterred party is making rational institutional calculations, and an institution facing what looks like institutional destruction may not be making the calculations that deterrence theory assumes rational actors make under pressure. 3 tracks: financial compression, military degradation, psychological fracture, all converging simultaneously toward a single inflection point. That convergence is not a coincidence. It is the architecture of a strategic closing argument. And somewhere between the diplomatic language being exchanged in Muscat and Geneva and the operational reality being documented one engagement at a time in the Strait of Hormuz, the next chapter of this story is being written. On June 15, 2026, a beam of light traveled from an American destroyer to a drone that never saw it coming. That beam didn't announce itself. It didn't leave a signature. It didn't give the enemy any information to learn from, adapt to, or build a counter strategy against. And that beam didn't just end a tactical engagement, it ended an era. The world that existed before that beam fired was a world where a nation without a conventional navy could still threaten the world's most powerful naval force by building enough cheap weapons to drain its magazines. The world that exists after that beam fired is a world where that mathematics no longer functions, where the cost asymmetry that defined a generation of asymmetric military doctrine has been permanently inverted by a system that costs electricity per engagement and has no magazine to run empty. That's not a future we're heading toward. That's the documented operational record of the Strait of Hormuz, June 2026. Iran's commanders understood what Helios would mean before May 7th. That's why they launched on May 7th. They were racing a timeline, the narrow window between the system approaching operational readiness and the system achieving active deployment in their theater, and they lost that race by approximately 3 weeks. 3 destroyers transited clean, 4 port facilities burned, and in the quiet of the bunkers where Iran's remaining strategic options are now being evaluated, options that used to fill those rooms with planning and possibility have been removed from the table one by one, drone by drone, engagement by engagement, until what remains is a list of choices that are either too costly to sustain or too escalatory to survive. The room is very quiet right now. It is quiet in a specific way. The silence of an institution that has not yet decided what to do, but knows with increasing clarity that what it used to do no longer works. Watch the strait in the days ahead, not for what you see, for what you don't see. The silence where the drone swarms used to be is the loudest signal the IRGC can send right now, because that silence will mean the operational analysis has finally penetrated the institutional politics, that the conclusion everyone in those bunkers already knows has been accepted by the faction with the most to lose from accepting it, and that the ceasefire framework holding in nominal form might grow into something more durable than a tactical pause. But if that silence breaks, if the swarms return, if the ballistic missiles move from dispersal to firing positions, if the hardline faction chooses institutional narrative over operational mathematics, then the desk where the Dark Eagle deployment request is sitting becomes a very short walk from a very significant decision. The beam has fired, the drone has fallen, and somewhere between the weapon Iran has no defense against and the decision Iran makes in response to understanding that, the next chapter is being written today. If this gave you a clearer picture than anything you've read or watched today, you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe so you never miss this level of analysis, and share it, because most people watching this conflict are still using the assumptions of an age that one beam of light just ended. The best thing you can do right now is make sure the people around you understand what actually changed.